Hey there fellow creators, Ben here from Cinder Studios, and this week I'm giving you an acrylic painter's guide to oil paints. If that doesn't make any sense, it will, so stick around. So in the past few years, as an acrylic painter, I've gotten into oils a little bit. I wouldn't say that I'm switching to oils by any means, but I've definitely learned some things and had to teach myself a few things, because a lot of the information out there on oils is stuff that most artists, especially who are new to oils, don't necessarily need to know. So here's first the things that I think you actually need to know if you're going to be approaching oil painting. Actually, before I get to that first one, I want to say that for all the seasoned oil painters out there, I could be totally wrong, so
I'd like to apologize to everyone in advance for this.
Okay, so the first thing I think you need to know when approaching oils is there's a lot of artists out there, a lot of oil painters out there, and all of them are going to have different opinions on what you need to start painting. I would say that the vast majority of those people are giving you fairly biased advice based on like their really long experience using oils, and a lot of them tend to forget you don't need as much equipment as they think you do. So a lot of the information they tell you about, oh, you have to have all this equipment, that can be pretty much disregarded entirely. The second of these sort of key things is that the traditional techniques between oils and acrylics, while are similar because they're both painting mediums, they are very different. Yeah, there's some things you can do with both, but in terms of from like the ground up, from the first dip of the brush in oil or spirits in oils, or dip of the brush in water for acrylics, the techniques are quite different. Now, much like acrylics, I do find that oils and paint quality makes a pretty big difference. I would say possibly even a bigger difference from a student grade oil to a artist grade oil than a student grade acrylic to a professional acrylic makes. The leap for oils, I think, is a lot greater between those two. Now, I do want to say, though, that buying good oils does not necessarily mean buying the best oils ever. I advocate for a nice high-quality brand in acrylic like Golden. Golden's sort of the top of the line. Oils, you can kind of get a really good mid-range option. You don't necessarily need the best of the best. I'm thinking of something like Old Holland, which is just insanely expensive. I don't expect most artists to even use that stuff. I wouldn't even use it myself, but I think sort of the mid-range to the higher mid-range is pretty much the way to go. Natural hair paintbrushes are ideal. They're sort of the ones that you will probably get to last longer if you're using oils, but they're not 100% required. Actually, I have a mix of both natural and synthetic hairs in my oil with my oil brushes. They both work, but I do notice that the natural hair bristles tend to hold up a little bit better. Along those same lines, this was really important, and probably the one piece of advice I got from other artists that I really want to pass on as the important oil thing is don't mix up your brushes. Don't take your acrylic brushes and then use them for an oil painting and then go back to acrylic. That causes problems. Most notably is oil in general, even when you really rinse it in the spirits and your solvents, some of that oil will remain in the brush pretty much forever. So if you're going back into acrylic with the same brush, that oil can bead up and cause weird adhesion issues with your acrylics. I haven't done a super extensive test on this, but it's just like I very specifically keep all of my oil brushes in a very separate area of the studio, so I don't have any chance of mixing them up. And the final thing that I think you need to know is that despite what some people say about oils and ventilation, you absolutely can paint with oils indoors. You don't have to go outside for it. If you live in a cold climate, I mean, you have to paint inside. But you do want to think about ventilation a bit. Usually if I'm doing a larger scale piece with oils, usually my whole basement will end up smelling like linseed oil for about a day or two as the oil starts to oxidize and out and dry. So it's important to note that if you're going to do oils exclusively, having a room with good ventilation is still really important. Okay, time to actually talk about what I think more oil painters should tell you about, and the things that I basically never hear about, which is really unfortunate because it's not explained well, I think, by a lot of seasoned oil painters. First is a classic oil technique known as alla prima. Some people refer to this as wet on wet or the Bob Ross technique. It's alla prima directly translates to all at once. It is essentially do the entire painting in one sitting. Now, this is actually way more challenging than it seems. Bob Ross makes it look really easy, and with some practice you can get there. But it's definitely not for everyone, and it's not the only technique. I don't really do that when I work with oils. I'll get up to a point and stop and let it dry and come back. The biggest issue I've found is that trying to do everything all at once can really easily get you to overwork your colors, and you keep blending it out and blending it out and blending it out, and then your colors get really muddy and the painting is kind of ruined. The good thing about oils is you can just scrape the canvas clean and start over while it's still wet. But yeah, it's not necessarily the technique for everyone. It's definitely not the technique for me. Another oil principle which I heard a lot, but I've never, until very recently, never really understood. And once it was actually explained for real, I was like, okay, that makes a lot more sense. And that's the phrase fat over lean. Now, coming from acrylics, I would say the term fat over lean, to me, meant thick over thin. This is not true. Not only is it not true, it's basically the complete opposite of how you're supposed to use oils, mostly. So fat over lean is, I would say, a better term besides fat over lean would be oil over spirits. When they say fat over lean fat, they're talking about oil fat. I guess fat over lean is sort of like a meat term more than a oil term. So you want to start by thinning with spirits, and as you build up your layers in oils, then you switch from thinning with spirits to just thinning with the oil. Now, this will extend your drying time of an already long extended dry time medium. But the reason for doing this is to be sure the paint adheres properly, as well as it will have less of a chance of cracking over time. Again, this is something that the term fat over lean is just not the best phrase for it. So if you're going to think fat over lean, think oil over spirits. The next thing I wish more oil painters talked about is that the dry time between paints, both in colors and in different brands of oil, can vary wildly. I have a handful of colors that will dry within a couple of days, and then ones that will take 2 or 3 weeks to dry. And the same goes with similar colors in different brands. If you guys saw my RNF pigment stick video review, in that video I actually did a comparison dry time test with a handful of common oil brands. And some of the brands, in particular Gamblin, their paints are really milled down to be super smooth. They take way longer to dry than comparable paints in similar quality across different brands. This is a really surprising thing. Granted, if you're mixing all your colors together, which I assume you are if you're painting, you're gonna find an average to when your paints dry, rather than having a specific set number. That's something that actually really kind of bothers me about oils versus acrylics. Acrylics don't have that problem. They dry to the same rate, unless you add a medium to them, regardless of color, regardless of brand, for the most part. And it's just like, I feel like that should be a consistent thing across the board, but for oils it just isn't. And not having that explained to me, I don't know if it would have made me less willing to try oils, but it's definitely something that I think more artists really need to talk about. I also think artists should let you know that, and I think some certainly do, that cleaning is not as important as it is with something like acrylics. Acrylics will dry into your brush and pretty much ruin them, unless of course you have a way of fixing that, like I do. But even if you don't get every piece of oil, every bit of that color out of your brush, that's perfectly fine, because your brushes are probably either going to be sitting in a tub of mineral spirits, or you're just going to be mixing the paint and moving the color around more and the oils. or just rubbing that out on a rag, there's a lot more you can do with just leaving your brushes even just a little bit dirty. And you know, that meticulous cleaning, well, certainly is important for the longevity of your brushes. You can probably just leave the brushes sit with paint on them, and a lot of artists will actually do that, come to think of it. Some oil painters will use tools such as this slotted piece of wood to keep their brushes stable in it, so it stays up off of your table or surface, or you know, what have you. I've seen some artists actually mount these vertically as well. That way you can just leave all of the color in your brush as you're working, switch between brushes, go back and forth, and not have to worry about cleaning all your brushes in between. The next thing I've found with oils is that detailing is a this could just be, again, I'm used to acrylics more, and honestly, come to think of it, since I've done this a bit more with oils, I have no idea how a lot of classic oil painters got details. Because as soon as I pull that paint down onto the canvas, it bleeds out because of the way oils work. I guess the paint would just have to be thicker, but still, with the simple glazes and getting those fine details, I have no idea how artists do that. And honestly, I don't really care about it, because it's like if I want details, I'm using acrylics. Now, one thing that's really cool about oils is that a little bit of paint goes an extremely long way. I found that even with the few paintings I've done, I'm using maybe 1/10 of the paint that I would with oils that I would be using on in the same surface area with acrylics. When I first started putting color out on my palettes and work with oils more, at least in the first few months or so that I was using them more regularly, I found that I was mixing up big batches of color and then using a really small amount of them. I'm like, okay, wow, I really don't need as much paint. So that is something that is a good thing. So if you're buying a high quality paint of any kind, acrylic or oil, that paint's gonna, you know, stretch a lot further. But I think it's even more so with oils. And the last thing that I think more artists should talk about when it comes to oils is that your tubes will leak or purge oil over time, period. They just will. Doesn't matter what brand it is, all of them do it. I've got a few brands in front of me from different brands. The Utrecht one bleeds out. I got a big drip out of the Blue Ridge one. The Gamblin, not so much, but I can definitely tell where it's starting to try a little bit. Williamsburg absolutely does it. It's a Rembrandt, which is student quality, but and it's newer, so hasn't really had the time to purge out yet. But that's one of those things, like, I open up my paint box and it's just like, there's just oil stains everywhere because the tubes leak. It's just what happens. For that reason, I would say in terms of storing your oils, it's important to store them somewhere that you're not worried about that oil getting everywhere. Because oil is flammable and you gotta kind of protect where you're keeping those. So to put all that together, I think my best advice for any acrylic painter or anyone looking into oils, it's important to know what you're getting into. I've said that in the past with all kind of different mediums, and I think it's the same for acrylics. You have to know what you're getting into. But I think even more so with oils. Having a bit of patience and an open mind is important, I think, with any medium, but especially with oils. As I mentioned before, a mid-level artist-grade paint is pretty much the best option most of the time. If you want the best of both worlds, I actually highly recommend doing an acrylic underpainting and then glazing with oils over top. I've done this a few times, and it's actually a really enjoyable way of painting. One thing I talked about in my recent 5 ways to stretch your paint volume video was for acrylics, it's really important to kind of work as you go, but you don't, and mix as you go, but it's not necessarily, you don't necessarily have to do that with oils. In fact, I find it really useful to mix all of my colors in advance and just let them sit on the palette and then go back in. So if you like spend some time before you even start a painting, spend 15, 20 minutes just mixing up a bunch of color, it's actually really valuable to do that too. Another suggestion is to, I should have mentioned this earlier, but get yourself some of this Galkid Light or Galkid Gel from Gamblin. This stuff is amazing. It is a godsend, and especially for coming from acrylics into oils, you're going to need this. This takes the variable dry time of oils down to like 2 days flat at most. This stuff is great, and I use it all the time, so get yourself some. Specifically, the Galkid Light, the oil version, this does what the fat over lean or oil over spirits principle does without adding the extra dry time. So you can go from spirits, add oil on top of them, but it still dries and you don't have to worry about all the, like, an extra 3 weeks added dry time by adding the regular oil. So those are my thoughts as an acrylic painter on what I think, if you're going into the medium, what you should know about oils. I could be wrong about a lot of this stuff. I'm not really sure. So for seasoned oil painters out there, let me know how I did. Did I treat your choice medium with respect, or did I miss something entirely? If you guys enjoyed this, be sure to hit the like button. Check me out in social links in the description box below, including the community Discord, where you can tell me I'm wrong about oils over there too. Subscribe for more. Keep on creating. And this has been from Cinder Studios, and I will see you guys next time. Okay, I know I've done some oil videos lately. I want to make note that I'm not turning this into an oil channel. I actually have a lineup of like 4 different acrylic tutorials coming up in the next couple of months. So they're coming, I promise.